Hello, I'm Christina Davis. Welcome to the program on U.S.-Japan Relations seminar at Harvard University. We're really excited to have a very large group joining us, some from the Harvard community. It is Wednesday evening. For our speaker, Paul Blustein, and many from Japan and China joining us in East Asia, it is Thursday morning. And we are here to discuss a really important topic at an important moment in time to think about trade policy. Because, of course, as the Trump administration is coming to a close, we are still in the middle of a trade war. It was 1 year ago that the US and China formed phase 1 trade deal that has not been concluded yet. And many of the tensions between the US and China continue and may even increase. What's so important for those of us who are closely following Japan is that Japan in many ways lies in the middle of this trade dispute between the United States and China. And the question we all think about is, will there be a way to bring this to a close? Will it worsen in the coming years? Could Japan play a constructive role in the middle? Well, in order to answer all of these questions, we're very fortunate to have with us today Paul Blustein, who's one of the leading experts on thinking about trade and especially the perspective on the trade war. We're going to have him speak today on the topic of Schism 2.0, China and America in the trade war with no end in sight. This is going to be a very interesting topic. And I would like to say that our co-sponsors for the presentation are the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies of Harvard University, and of course, we are the program on US-Japan relations. And we're also very fortunate to have here the speaker, Paul Blustein, who has been one of the leading journalists. He has spent over 30 years as a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He is a top writer on all topics. And yet, after 30 years as a leading journalist, he then shifted to writing these amazing books on international economic institutions that are really path-breaking because they involve deep research into the institutions, the facts on the ground, interviews with the participants, and all written with a flair that many of us scholars cannot aspire to match. So his book, Misadventures of the Most Favored Nations, Clashing Egos, Inflated Ambitions, and the Great Shambles of the World Trade System is one of my favorites. I highly recommend. Everything from chapters on Clueless in Seattle to other details on the problems of the World Trade System. He's also written several books on the International Monetary Fund, and his most recent book is on the US-China trade dispute called Schism, China, America, and the Fracturing of the Global Trading System. And I can tell you, I taught this book as part of my class on East Asian trade policy last spring, and it was really a great hit with the Harvard University students. And I hope he will write another book as an update before I have to teach the course again. So I'll be taking notes on the talk today. Before we go on to turn over to Paul, I'd like to introduce our event for next week, where we will look at Japan's transformation in the new normal. Our own Harvard Business School professor, Hirotaka Takeuchi, will lead the discussion next week if you want to join us December 14th. And I'd like to remind you of our normal Zoom etiquette, that you should keep your microphone muted unless you are speaking. And the chat button will be closed during the speech, but then open up during the Q&A period where you can write a chat, or you may raise your hand in the participant with the blue button. And we hope to have 20 minutes at the end to have some questions for our speaker. We would like to ask you to respect privacy and not take any separate recording of participants. Great. Well, Paul, thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Okay, I'm going to do my share screen and share that and share this. Thank you very much, Christina. It's so gratifying to hear that students enjoy reading my books. And I also want to thank Shin Fujihira of the program on U.S.-Japan relations for, among other things, suggesting the very ingenious title for this talk, which of course is based on the book that Christina mentioned, which was published a little over a year ago, and which I'll be drawing on pretty extensively in my remarks, as you'll see. I also appreciate the opportunity to engage in a little bit of shameless self-promotion for the book at a time when people may be thinking about what to give their favorite trade wonk on their Christmas or Hanukkah list or whatever holiday you celebrate. So let me begin. Oops, I need to make sure I can click to the next slide here. How do I? Okay, here we go. So I think there's a conventional wisdom that's forming about what the Biden administration will do about the trade conflict with China. And it goes something like this: that despite the vast differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that when it comes to trade conflict with China, there's going to be a lot of similarities between their two approaches. Biden's approach, of course, will be much less chaotic than Trump's, just because of his experience and personality and so forth. And his administration, I have no doubt, will handle the issue with much greater finesse. And most importantly, there'll be a big emphasis on building alliances with other countries to handle the problem. But the conventional wisdom is that that his approach will be similar to Trump's at a fundamental level in terms of the aims and the premises on which it's started and so forth. And you see this reflected in some of these headlines that I found in articles that have been published in the past several months about what Biden is likely to do. And the Chinese, I think there's a similar kind of conventional wisdom is taking hold. You can see that in the quote at the lower left corner of this slide from a scholar at Fudan University in Shanghai, who says tactically it'll be easier to work with Biden, but strategically there's not going to be much difference with Trump. Well, I am not so sure about this conventional wisdom. And I think we ought to start by remembering what Trump's policies have been. First, it was bullying China, basically just by slapping them with tariffs unilaterally, just on the administration's own say so, in the hope that would force China to make concessions. There was a big focus on the trade deficit. Trump himself, of course, was famously obsessed with the bilateral U.S.-China trade deficit, which most economists would argue is a pretty meaningless metric. Another important element which the Trump people pursued very aggressively was decoupling, and this one, in the prime example of this was Huawei, the big telecommunications company, probably China's most important multinational. And the Trump people didn't just bar Huawei from entering the U.S. market and try to keep them from expanding elsewhere, but really tried to, in effect, strangle the company by cutting it off from supplies of crucial U.S. technology like semiconductors and software. Another element was, of course, that the Trump administration, they went it alone. Perhaps the most clear illustration of this was on the third day of Trump's presidency. He withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Obama had signed, although Congress hadn't ratified it. And finally, there was a real flouting of international trade rules, of rules of the World Trade Organization. Now, this was not entirely about China. There were other issues involved in it, but it was partially about China. And I would go so far as to say that it was aimed at subverting the WTO. The Trump administration has blocked appointments of any new members of the WTO's appellate body. That's in effect its Supreme Court. So that's really gutted the dispute settlement function of the WTO, which is in many ways it's called its crown jewel. It's best functioning part. The benefits have been paltry, and the costs have been enormous. I think China's has these mercantilistic trade practices, which I would argue, are the subject of very legitimate grievances, but they were barely addressed in that phase one deal that Christina mentioned, where this is the deal that the U.S. and China agreed last January. The only items that are included of that kind are ones that I would say China is decided they wanted to take for their own benefit. For example, strengthening their intellectual property protection regime. The tariffs that Trump slapped on China raised costs to American companies and consumers. It hurt some U.S. manufacturers. Some people lost jobs. China, of course, wasn't going to take this bullying wasn't going to take this bullying laying down. They retaliated with tariffs of their own on American soybeans and pork and other products. That obliged the Trump administration to massively increase by tens of billions of dollars to American farmers. Some manufacturing operations did move out of China to other countries. Vietnam and Indonesia and India and others received some of this, but that simply meant that the U.S. was importing more from those Southeast Asians and South Asian nations. It didn't really change the trade situation in the U.S. The Chinese promises to import more from the U.S. have fallen short of targets.
Hello.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, okay. Maybe somebody isn't. Okay, you can hear me. That's the important thing. They've fallen short of targets by about 57% at last count. Now, this is not. You can't blame Trump for that. A lot of that has to do with the COVID pandemic. But anyway, and I hope no one here believes the rhetoric that you heard coming out of the White House that China was paying the tariffs and pouring tens of billions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury. Now, the Trump people, you have to say, did have one success, and I've put the word success in quotation marks because I'm trying to be sardonic here. And that involves the terrible damage it's been inflicted on the WTO. There are no members of the appellate body left. They've all their terms have expired. Some of them resigned to take other jobs, and the Trump administration refused to allow the appointment of any new ones. They may regard this as a success. I do not, and I want to remind people of what it is that the WTO does and what benefits it confers. I know this is very familiar ground to many of you. Professor Davis has written some really eloquent stuff about this, and I know she's I know that any of you who are students will have heard this in much more with a much more scholarly flair than I'm capable of. But I think these are worth they bear repeating. That the WTO keeps a lid on the import barriers of its member countries. It requires them to, when they had disputes with each other, they have to go to adjudication before neutral, impartial tribunals instead of engaging in resorting to tit-for-tat sanctions. And that keeps international commerce from operating according to the law of the jungle, or might makes right. And the result of that is a stability and predictability in international trade, which helps foster global economic growth. Because in the absence of that kind of predictability, when countries can just raise or lower barriers on each other based on whatever whims powerful people have, there's going to naturally be a reluctance by companies to invest in the kinds of facilities, operations, or expanding their existing operations in ways that create jobs and raise living standards. Well, so if you look at what those Trump policies were and what the results were, I think actually the Biden administration is highly unlikely to pursue them, and to some extent will do the reverse. And here's the central contention of what I'll be arguing in my remarks today: is that the Biden administration may well adopt a WTO-centered approach to dealing with China. Now, that would be in diametric opposition to what the Trump administration did. And now, I can't be sure what the Biden administration is going to do, but I'm going to argue that if he doesn't do that, he should. Now, the conventional wisdom is right in one very important sense. Biden's hands have been tied by the things that Trump has done. He can't just scrap that phase one deal because it includes some Chinese promises to buy a lot more American stuff in 2021. So he wouldn't want to start off his administration by saying, "Oh no, we're not going to hold the Chinese to that promise." Of course, that wouldn't be very politically popular. He can't just roll back the sanctions that Trump has imposed on some Chinese companies and industries, because that would be harshly criticized. He'd be criticized for kowtowing to communist dictators. And there's also been some important changes in China over the past 2, 3, 4 years. I think because of what the Trump administration has done, the Chinese have become even more convinced that America is bent on containing China's rise. So they've doubled down in the past couple of years on initiatives aimed at self-sufficiency. The latest iteration of this is President Xi Jinping's what he calls dual circulation strategy, which is aimed at reducing dependence on foreign suppliers. But even before Trump, even before all these problems with the Trump administration, there's a very hardening bipartisan consensus about policy toward China in general, but particularly not just about the sort of military diplomatic issues, but also on trade. That the policies in the previous administrations fell short of what was necessary. That although now China did agree when it joined the WTO in 2001 to very stringent terms, far-reaching reductions in tariffs, dismantling of trade barriers, and there was a huge amount of optimism at that time about what its future course would be. And I think that optimism has proven misplaced. The policies of engagement, there was a lot of strategic dialogues between the two countries. WTO litigation was brought against China. All of these failed to prevent the evolution of China Inc., state capitalism, techno-nationalism, by whatever name you call it. It's a very divergent economic system from what we have certainly in the U.S. and other advanced industrial countries. So in the words of Bob Lighthizer, who's the current trade representative, the optimist thought that China would become, quote, an exotic version of Canada. I love this quote so much. I made it the title of one of the chapters in one of my books, where I began to go through this process of how China evolved after its entry into the WTO. In 2003, which was just 2 years after its entry, China established a couple of very powerful agencies. The acronyms are SASAC and NDRC. I'll spare you the details, but in brief, one of these was an agency that exercised very powerful oversight and supervisory control over the China's very far-flung network of state-owned enterprises. And the other is a very powerful planning agency, which was given power over important all sorts of aspects of the way the Chinese economy works and what market outcomes would be, through its control over things like electric power pricing, where which sorts of industries would get subsidies and so forth. Then in 2006, China launched what was called the Indigenous Innovation Initiative, which was one of the first, was the first, I guess, where specifically aimed at trying to promote the fortunes of China's own national champions, to some extent at the expense of foreign competitors. And horror stories began to sort of come out from the foreign business community trying to crack the Chinese market. And some of the most notorious examples were in high-speed rail and wind power, where foreign companies that wanted to crack the Chinese market came in, and where they were induced in one way or another to share their technology with their Chinese partners, and found that their technologies were kind of, shall we say, appropriated, and they were suddenly facing Chinese competitors using that technology against them in global markets. Now, all of this trend accelerated when President Xi Jinping rose to the top position in 2013. Under the Xi regime, we've seen the Made in China 2025 initiative, which is probably the most ambitious that China's undertaken to date, where it's aimed at reducing dependence on foreign suppliers and promoting indigenous companies. There's been a retreat from rule of law under Xi Jinping. There's a growing reach into businesses of all kinds, not just state-owned enterprises, but private ones as well, of the Communist Party. Controls on digital flows in cyberspace. I have a whole chapter in the book on what happened during the Xi regime. But the long and short is that we've ended up with a real schism. I mean, this is one of the reasons for the title of the book. It's a schism that separates China's economic model from that of other countries, and I argue in the book that this really has to be squarely faced. Now, having said all that, I think that this very different approach that China has adopted is often mischaracterized as if China just ignores the rules of the international trading system and blatantly cheats. And you see this reflected in a quote that I found from Richard Ellings, very eminent guy, executive director for the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property. Said at a hearing, China is a member of the WTO. It's supposed to live up to certain requirements, and it lives up to virtually none of them. Well, I think that's really a gross overstatement, quite inaccurate. I think a much fairer and more useful way of defining the issue is to say that China's economic system has evolved in, these are very profoundly problematic ways that the WTO rulebook can't always address. And the Chinese are real masters at exploiting the weaknesses in the WTO system. A lot of this stems from the lack of transparency in the Chinese system. Nobody can tell for sure when the party state is promoting industrial policy goals at the expense of foreign competitors. I don't mean to defend this or whitewash it. I think the evidence that those sorts of practices exist is pretty persuasive, but it's not conclusive in every instance. And it's not the same as violating rules. It's in a kind of a paradoxical way. I think we can say that the Chinese care very much about not clearly violating rules. China implemented market opening commitments in the extensive reforms that it committed to, not 100%, dragged its feet in a lot of areas, but it implemented a lot of them. And to the extent rule breaking occurs, substantiation is very difficult, if not absolutely impossible. So I would argue that accusing China of flagrantly disregarding the rules, it's wrong and it misses the point. It leads to the conclusion, well, no one else should care about rules either, and nothing but unilateral action would work. And that leads me to a second misconception that one often hears, which is that and here you see expressed by Greg Mesto, who's an economist I have a lot of respect for. He said in an article published about a year and a half ago, the World Trade Organization has proven utterly incapable of controlling China's protectionism in the last 2 decades. Well, again, I mean, I think that's certainly an overstatement. It is not wholly without merit. Legitimate complaints can be made, and certainly are made, about China's trade regime, where the applicability of WTO rules is uncertain. Violations are very difficult to prove. I go into one of the really interesting examples of that in the book, where I write about a case that's come to be known as the public bodies case, where the U.S. government tried to did impose duties on Chinese goods that U.S. officials believed were illegally subsidized by China. The WTO appellate body said, America, you can't do that because you haven't proved to our satisfaction that China really is subsidizing these imports or these exports to the U.S. So this is an example of a really clear example of one of the deficiencies of the WTO in dealing with China. But again, China implemented the vast majority of the commitments it undertook when it joined. And when China gets hauled before WTO tribunals, as it has on many occasions, and those tribunals rule against China and say, no, you're abrogating the rules, China has been very good about respecting those rulings and complying with them. At least it's been a lot. I would argue that its record of compliance is a lot more commendable than that of the United States. So for those reasons, I conclude that the WTO remains the single best way of inducing China to follow international trade rules. The problem is it's far, far from perfect. We need a much more forceful response than the multilateral trading system has delivered so far. By that, I mean one that would actually work with China, unlike the kind of bullying that we saw from the Trump administration. So one of the favorites of my friends in the trade wonk community is that the U.S. should join the what's now called the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Trans-Pacific Partnership. This argument is based on the idea that when Trump pulled the U.S. out of the TPP, that was a self-inflicted wound. The TPP was a very powerful group of countries. You see them in the slide, shaded in over on the right side, shaded in blue. That's a group of countries that comprise about 37% of global GDP. They had agreed on dismantling almost all trade barriers among themselves, and to engage in quite deep economic integration among with this. So this would be a big, powerful trade bloc that would confront China. And the urgency of the calls for that the U.S. should get back into the TPP by joining what's now called the CPTPP. It's really intensified in just the past couple of months, because a trade bloc that China was quite instrumental in forming, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was finalized quite recently. It's not nearly as deep integration, not even remotely close as the CPTPP, but nonetheless, that has raised concerns that America is being left behind in the race to integrate in the Asia Pacific region. And the real argument for why this would help with China, you can see this reflected in a quote from Arvind Subramanian, a really terrific trade economist, down at the bottom of the slide. He says, this is a recent article. He says, the Biden administration must consider the regional route that Trump abandoned. It would likely force China to the negotiating table because China would not want to be kept out of such a large market. That's very much the argument one often hears about why quitting the TPP was a self-inflicted wound. Well, the first problem that Joe Biden would have in following that advice is political opposition, even within the Democratic Party, to getting into another trade agreement. But let's assume he could overcome that. Even so, I question whether the CPTPP has all that much potency as a lever against China. And you see the title of my 9th chapter, which is about the TPP, I call it Trans-Pacific Delusions. So you can see kind of what my attitude is. This is not because I think the TPP or the CPTPP is a terrible deal. And there's a lot of, I think it's actually quite a good trade deal. And I know there are a lot of very good arguments made by experts in geopolitics for why it would be a good thing if America got back in. But the problem is that trade barriers in the Asia Pacific region are already quite low, and China holds a dominant position in goods that it exports to TPP countries. I highly commend to you an article by Mark Wu. You can find it on the internet. Mark Wu of Harvard Law School, where he did a real deep dive into the trade flows among the TPP countries, looking at individual sectors, individual products, to see what the effect would be if China were excluded and the TPP provisions were implemented. And his conclusion was that the economic threat to China of being excluded from the TPP appears to have been grossly exaggerated. I think it's a very convincing argument. Now, I know that for my friends in the Japanese government and in the Japanese trade community, this is quite a bitter pill. If the U.S. doesn't rejoin the TPP by signing up with the CPTPP, Prime Minister Abe spent a great deal of political capital negotiating Japan's entry into the TPP. But if there is a superior approach to dealing with the U.S.-China trade conflict, I think Japan should support it for exactly the reason that Professor Davis mentioned. Japan is right in the middle of all this, and it would really be hurt if the U.S.-China trade conflict kind of just explodes out of control. So what do I think that superior approach is? Well, it's to double down on multilateralism, and by multilateralism, I don't just mean in the Asia Pacific. I mean worldwide. So that's the title of the final chapter of my book, "Make the WTO Great Again." I think the WTO, as I said, is ought to be at the center of the approach to dealing with China. The first and foremost, that would involve bringing a really big case against China at the WTO of the kind that's never been brought before, with the U.S. leading a broad coalition of countries. And those of you who are knowledgeable about trade in China, I'm sure, are aware that this is not my idea. I'm nowhere near expert to come up with anything as brilliant as this. This was proposed by Jennifer Hillman, who is a former member of the WTO appellate body. In other words, a former Supreme Court justice of the WTO. And in an article that she published a couple of years ago where she proposed this, she suggested it could be based heavily on the nullification or impairment provision of WTO rules. This is a rather quite seldom used provision, but what it basically says is that a country can be found guilty, and of course subject then to fairly serious sanctions if its policies nullify or impair the legitimate expectations of its trading partners, even if no specific rule is being broken. So what she argues is that this is really tailor-made for dealing with the China Inc. problem. Now, this has been criticized for two very important and I think quite valid reasons. First is, these are very difficult cases to win. It's far from certain China would lose. And second, it would take years and years and years to litigate. What I think that criticism, I think those are both very important points. But what I think that misses is the WTO system tries to force disputants to negotiate settlements with each other. And my argument is that China would be much more likely to be forthcoming in negotiations to try to settle such a case, and than it would be if it's facing the kind of unilateral threats and bullying that it had from the Trump administration, and it would be much more willing to talk about the kinds of structural reforms that weren't included in the phase one deal, which after all a lot of people in the Chinese leadership want. Now, before bringing any such case, the Biden administration would have to revive the WTO. As I said, the dispute settlement system is virtually moribund because no appellate body members are left. I would hope that that arguments about how the appellate body ought to be reconstituted and reformed would be hopefully addressed fairly quickly in the Biden administration, so that this would allow appointments of new appellate body members to be made as progress materializes on that issue. Now, why should we think Biden might do this? I said earlier, I thought the Biden administration would adopt an approach like this. Well, I was going to tell you that Jennifer Hillman is a leading candidate for U.S. Trade Representative, but just as I logged onto Twitter about an hour before this event, I saw there's breaking news. No, it's going to be Katherine Tai, who I interviewed for my book. I can tell you she is whip smart, knows China inside and out, and is a Mandarin speaker and knows the WTO inside and out as well. Whether I don't know what Katherine Tai's views are on Hillman's idea, but I hope I've convinced you that a WTO-centered approach would be good policy. I certainly think it's almost indisputable. It would be politically popular to bring a big WTO case against China, where a whole bunch of countries would join the U.S. And I think it would be at least a lot less controversial than a lot of other initiatives you can think of in the trade realm. I'm not sure how much time I have.
You are running a little short because we have 25 minutes left.
Okay.
So maybe quickly go to the.
Yep. I'll skip over my next 3 slides and go to the end. I'm happy to talk about decoupling, which is obviously a very hot issue. and also the issue of are the U.S. and China locked in some sort of existential battle over liberal democracy worldwide? But let me just end on one very important point, which is it takes two to tango. And if the Biden administration adopts a WTO-centered approach of the sort that I've outlined here, China may well refuse to respond constructively. They may just say, well, sorry, you elected Donald Trump before, you may elect someone like that again, and we are not going to, we're going our own way. We're pursuing self-sufficiency. We are not going to change our model. And if so, of course, the Biden administration would have to have a plan B. I hope I've convinced you that there's a plan A out there that would be well worth trying. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. You certainly convinced me. I will let out a cheer of support for a WTO-centered solution to the trade war.
Great.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd like to turn and open to questions, and we'll lead off with two of our associates. First, we have Diana Stanescu, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the program in U.S.-Japan Relations, having just this last summer received her PhD from Princeton University.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your great presentation. I have also had the pleasure of reading your book. I have not taught it in any class yet, but maybe sometime in the future when I'm also a professor. And so I'll keep it really short in the interest of time. You have highlighted this doubling down on multilateralism as a way forward in US-China policy, and I think a lot of observers agree with this. And one of the solutions that you have put forward is this WTO-centered approach. The second part of the argument, as per your book and many other observers that have also argued the same, is that there should be an engagement with the allies of the United States, like Europe and Japan, who have similar interests in this respect. So I have read a lot about this, and everyone mentions this, but I have not seen anybody actually put forth concrete solutions or concrete steps beyond bolstering the WTO in which the upcoming administration can actually coordinate with Europe and Japan to this purpose. And I would like to hear what you have to say about what such concrete steps could look like.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to have to be, as I say, I would hope that now Japan was very reluctant to litigate against China in the WTO for some time because the Chinese took it when they first joined the WTO. When countries brought cases against them, they took it very kind of personally, and they bristled and they took, as if they're being accused of bad faith. And Japan, because of its what is euphemistically called here the unfortunate history between the two countries, was particularly careful, but did finally join a case on rare earths. But I would think, because Japan and most of the European Union have, a lot of similar grievances about Chinese practices. Certainly the EU Business Council in China, I think that's what it's called, echoes a lot of the same complaints. They don't like the America's unilateral tariffs, but they do agree that there is a lot of problems. So I would think that they'd be quite receptive to now. Each of them would have their own ideas about how such a case should be handled and what the complaints would be. But beyond that, of course, the other issue is that's going to be very touchy is decoupling. And I'd like to talk at some more length about that, but just in the context of your question about bringing alliances along, it makes no sense. I mean, this is really one of the worst things about the Trump administration's decoupling approach was it was self-defeating. Because as U.S. companies and industries were banned from selling high-tech products to Chinese manufacturers. Well, manufacturers in Japan and Germany and Taiwan said, "Oh, well, okay, well, we can sell, this, that, or the other thing." Now, then the U.S. had to clamp down even further and say, "Well, no, but your product includes this component or that component that originally came from the U.S." So they were able to put something of a stop to that, but not completely. And decoupling is not going to be successful if first of all, I think a lot of it is misplaced and overdone. But even if you can make a compelling argument for why it should be done, say for national security reasons, because there's some, it'll enhance China's ability to spy or to conduct various military or geopolitical operations. It's idiotic to try to do it, just one country at a time. So I would certainly expect, to the extent the Biden administration does pursue that kind of approach, that it would want to try to convince other and understand the need to convince other countries to go along with it.
Great. I want to turn to Takashi Nakao, who is one of our associates with the US-Japan program, who comes to us from the Ministry of Finance, where he works in the Customs Bureau, and he will ask a question next. And I would ask Paul to keep your answers a little short, because we are getting a lot of interest in your remarks, and so.
Okay, I once I get going in Q&A, I'm sorry.
No, it's great. Okay, Takashi, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Blustein, for your comprehensive and informative presentation. And with regard to the WTO, well, you already touched upon in your presentation, but some people pointing out the WTO limitations, and existing WTO agreements are not dealing with the China's unique system properly, such as subsidies or state-owned enterprise. Also, the WTO dispute settlement does not handle the issues which are not covered by the agreement, such as the competition policy or investment. So the importance of the WTO has been highlighted in the presentation, but please let us know how you think of these challenges.
Well, I would hope that the Biden administration would also, of course, in addition to the other things I mentioned, that it would try to launch negotiations to expand WTO rules to cover some of those things. But as we know, WTO negotiations have just been paralyzed since pretty much since the collapse of the Doha round. It's very, very difficult with 164 countries to reach agreement on anything. I mean, they can't even reach agreement on fisheries subsidies. But what I like about the idea of using a negotiated settlement in the context of WTO litigation, using the nullification or impairment provision of the rules, whatever China would agree to as part of a negotiated settlement, if it agreed, would then in effect become rules that would bind it, right? Because if you agree to something in WTO litigation, and then you fail to live up to that, you can be hauled before a tribunal again. And so it's just as if these are specific rules that apply only to China, just as the rules that China agreed to in its protocol are rules that are specific to China. So I think that would be a way of sort of short-circuiting or getting around the other problems that have kept the WTO so paralyzed all these years. It would be a much more efficient way of handling some of these immediate concerns that they're quite serious that people have about China specifically.
Michael Wen, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question directly.
Thank you, Stin. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate your time. So I came from China, and right now I'm an MP student at Kingsley School. I'm really interested in the trade war. So clearly, you may mention or not, it's actually you mentioned a lot, you use against China. So I do notice other people, dealing with, China. That's so I wonder, is there anything under the WTO framework that can be constructive or can working with? Because think of that, China is a huge market, right? So is that possible that US, you also mentioned that actually US government banned the US companies such as Honeywell, GE to export the high-tech products to the US, to the China. So I came here is want to listen opinions. I fully respect everyone, and I want to looking for where we can work with and where we can draw the conductives to benefit both of the people from two countries.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I want to be responsive to your question, but could you
yeah, I want to more my question is where for China, US, even under the trade war and technology war, and also the some political issue, so still can working together on some area under the WTO framework?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, again, this is something I hope the Biden administration will pursue pretty aggressively. There have been talks that have been launched on e-commerce. For example, I mean, this is crucially important to have some kind of global agreement on digital data flows. One of the big problems, this is again one of those areas where people are saying, well, the WTO is never going to be able to do anything because so many countries are involved, and not only the U.S. and China have vastly different ideas about flows of data, but Europe has very different ideas about how that ought to be governed. But this is again an area where if the U.S. just tries to cut China off, I think there's recognition by both countries that there's a risk of economic dynamism being very severely hurt in not only in both of their countries but all around the world, if because after all, the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy, with all the fantastic strengths that each of them has, they're complementary to each other. I mean, where China is strong, the U.S. tends to be weak, and where the U.S. is strong, China tends to be weak. So, and I think there's recognition of that. Without having ever asked Catherine Tai the question, I think she appreciates that very much. But of course, there are some very, very serious differences about because China is so obsessed, frankly, with making sure that the Communist Party control over within China's borders is not disturbed by any kind of dissent. So that right there is a huge fundamental issue that is going to be very difficult to overcome on this issue of e-commerce in particular. But I think there's going to be an effort, and I hope there will be an effort to try to achieve some kind of baseline agreement on that would help preserve the kind of mutually reinforcing dynamism that the two economies can achieve if they don't decouple.
I'm excited that you would choose e-commerce as one of the potential areas to work out their problems. And it's interesting because that's also where Japan has put a lot of priority in its own trade diplomacy. So if we think of a role for Japan as mediator, it would be this trade free flow with trust, trying to find a common ground between RCEP level of deference to sovereignty, whatever a country chooses on e-commerce rules, versus the TPP, US-Japan, higher standard rules. So
Yes.
that could be interesting. I wanted to turn, one of the differences between the US and China that is coming to the forefront right now is highlighted in a couple of our questions. Deirdre Conley and Javier Wisniewski both ask about the upcoming tariffs on cotton, which are really getting at the coerced labor of in the Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur population has suffered many detention camps and coerced labor as a problem highlighted by many groups, and the US Congress is passing legislation. And so these two questions ask about what are these tariffs that are about a difference of values, not intellectual property theft. Will they be different? And I wonder if you could even tie that back to Min Yi's question about the WTO does have moral authority in China, but it's going to use WTO rules in its own defense. So if the United States has sanctions that try to stop all trade with China over its own human rights judgment without a UN resolution, will we see this step to a WTO dispute with China on the good side of the law? What do you think will happen on this issue about labor policies, and is the WTO able to solve such a difficult problem?
It's a really good question. I certainly go along with the sort of conventional wisdom that the Biden administration is going to be is in many ways going to be tougher than the Trump administration on human rights with China. You know, after all, President Trump famously, I mean, according to John Bolton's book, told President Xi Jinping, you know, you're doing the right thing in Xinjiang by putting those people in all those camps. Now, that has not stopped a lot of the hawks who work in the Trump administration from cooking up all kinds of sanctions, you know, and this one involving cotton products from Xinjiang is an important one. I will be surprised if the Biden administration goes anywhere near as far as, if I understand the question, you know, as you know, to cut off trade with China over human rights. Of course, the Clinton administration tried this in its first couple of years, tried to use the real threat of you know, of really slapping very high tariffs on all Chinese imports. And Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, went over and he was basically told, "This is none of your business." And you know, and basically the Chinese stared the U.S. down. And after that point, Bill Clinton became you know, an advocate of the view that no, you know, that kind of sledgehammer approach isn't going to work with China. They're simply not going to give up the Communist Party control. This is their prime, you know, this is the thing that matters to them above all. As far as the specific issue of Xinjiang, you know, I was just listening to a podcast of Trade Talks about this last night. This is their late, you know, the Trade Talks podcast that Chad Bown and Sumaya Keynes do. It's terrific. And they had a guest on who argued, you know, well, look, there is forced labor. There is a serious problem with forced labor in Xinjiang. We know it, but it's extremely hard to prove. It's extremely hard to prove which products coming out of China contain cotton that is made by members of ethnic minorities who have been forced to work in the cotton fields or forced to work in factories, whatever it is. Because I mean, there aren't that many products that are actually exported directly from Xinjiang. This is mostly you know, cotton that's inputted into goods that are sold. So I think it's going to be you know, I will be surprised if the Biden administration goes too far beyond, you know, making this issue, you know, being very forceful diplomatically and outspoken about the problem, but then without being able to actually show which Chinese products do contain forced labor components to actually, to go to the extent of imposing tariffs. The big question I have about this kind of approach is it really effective? Is it anything more than just a feel-good policy? In other words, we will feel pure as a driven snow if we refuse to buy any Chinese products that might contain cotton that's been produced by forced labor in Xinjiang. I mean, I will feel better knowing that I'm not wearing those clothes. I don't buy them for my kids, whatever. But will that really, my question is, will that really help? Will that change anything on the ground in Xinjiang province? I have my doubts. And partly for that reason, I'm skeptical, and I hope the Biden administration doesn't go overboard on this, because I'm not sure how much good it does. It might even do harm. So anyway, I'd be very interested in knowing if anyone has any ideas about why this would be more than just a feel-good policy.
Right. I agree with you that there would be such a backlash of protecting its own sovereignty that it would be difficult for China to change its policies. We are coming to near the end of time, but I wanted to get a couple more questions in really quickly. So I wanted to turn Natsuko Sakata, who is a foreign ministry official, has an important question that is looking at how will decoupling proceed if the US under President Biden completely focuses on domestic investment, which is his priority, recovery from COVID, while China and East Asia use TPP and RCEP to restructure their global value chains. And so I think Sakata-san's question is, what is your sense about this separation of the global value chains through this future trajectory? Is that a future you could see? And I just add on that we have two other questions on the Belt and Road Initiative, which are also sort of related to moving global supply chains towards China. And so if you could close with a few remarks about this and whether Japan's role in that shift, is it going to go along with the move to deepen ties, or will it stay separate? All of that in 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'm particularly fascinated by the first question. I think it's a very good one. I think a lot of Biden's campaign promises about the Build Back Better it involves a lot of subsidization that may be WTO inconsistent, and I think there's going to be a real some real thorny dilemmas that they're going to be facing about how to domesticize supply chains and subsidize American producers to secure supplies of critical goods without running afoul of well, for one thing, the WTO government procurement agreement rules are the U.S. might be subject to litigation there, so anyway, this is a real thorny problem for the Biden folks. That if they want to bring a big WTO case against China, and or more importantly, if they want to try to reach some new WTO agreements on subsidies that would restrain China from engaging in some of the practices that it has, they're going to be accused of hypocrisy if they pursue all that stuff too far. And I think they're going to have. My guess is that whether they will worry that much about WTO consistency or not, of course we don't know. my guess is that the lawyers at U.S. Trade Representative's office are going to be raising their hands and saying, "Hey, wait a minute, there are some legal issues here that we have to try to manage." But yeah, it's a very good question, and it suggests that decoupling, because of COVID, it's all these new dimensions have entered into the debate. I'm not quite sure what the Belt. I don't know if we have time to talk about Belt and Road. I'm not quite sure what it.
It's almost the other side. If the US is doubling down on Buy America, and China's Buy China is done in an outward foreign aid policy as part of the Belt and Road. So will it help to both build its domestic economy, but at the same time tie in foreign policy allies?
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. I mean, though, of course, China has now recently, just in the past, I think 2 or 3 days, said, "Oh, we're scaling back the Belt and Road because a lot of foreign countries in Asia and Eurasia don't seem to appreciate it very much, and so maybe we're wasting money. And after all, and actually, we kind of need the money more than we thought." So, but I'm not sure. I will confess, that isn't the question I've thought deeply enough about to be able to give a very sophisticated answer. But it's a good question, and I obviously need to think about it.
Well, you've helped us think through many of the issues surrounding this trade war and given a very clear recommendation going forward of one possible approach to take. And I think that it's fascinating if doubling down on the WTO, making it better, could work. I've also often thought that one route for the TPP is, if you reform and expand and have high standards, could we see a race of the US and China to join TPP? Who can jump high enough, fast enough? And that kind of positive momentum. Again, you can't force China in a blunt trade war to change. So either through the force of the WTO, where China's a member and there are rules that everyone accepts and there's collective pressure, or if you could make TPP enticing enough that then some reforms would be part of joining a new club. But we will see. It's exciting to watch and hope.
That would be ideal, for sure.
We've had many questions that we couldn't quite get to that are in the chat, but I think our audience at least has been able to read through these useful perspectives. And I apologize that we weren't able to get through to everyone, but this is an important topic. And thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your time and thoughts with us tonight.
I'm very honored. I really appreciate everyone paying attention. That's really very, very kind.
And please do write a second book on Schism 2.
Oh.
I will line up to pre-purchase.
I'm so thrilled to hear that your students liked it, at least more than the textbook, perhaps.
Thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it.